Yeah, so this talk is about multimodal processing and some sort of mathematical modeling at multiple levels. So we've got some sort of mathematical parts, we've got some spiking neural networks, some artificial neural networks, yeah, well, I guess we'll see that as it comes. So just for people who don't know what I mean by multimodal, basically the situation is we have something like this. We've got some sort of cluttered auditory visual environment where there's different, in this case, different animals making different sounds. So you can see them, you can hear them, and you want to find out something about a particular object of interest. In this case, probably what you'd be most interested in this scenario is the fact that there's this tiger. And basically you want to use both auditory and visual information to get the best possible understanding of what's going on in the world. So I'm going to simplify that a lot. And the task is going to be specifically, there's going to be some object that's moving left or right, and there's going to be some amount of background noise. So this is the target object moving left or right, and this is the background noise. Okay, and so as David said, I like doing spiking neural networks. So my first thought on starting this problem was to try and train a spiking neural network to solve this task. Let's try that. Did the simplest possible thing. So this is the architecture here. So we have an auditory population. I've written auditory in scare quotes here because it's a very, very simple auditory model. It's just there's two populations and one is firing at a higher rate than the other. So it's like the simplest possible abstraction of a sort of auditory situation. There's a visual input as well. In this case, it's noisy moving bars. You have two areas receiving inputs, unimodal inputs. So one area receiving only auditory information, one receiving only visual information. And these are spiking neurons. And that feeds into a multisensory area, receiving inputs from both. And then that then feeds out to a decision area. And basically, because of the way that we train it, which I'm going to come back to in the next slide, this consists of two leaky neurons, but that don't fire any spikes. That's basically just because that makes it easier to train with the surrogate gradient descent method that we use. So this is going to be important. And just talk briefly about surrogate gradient descent, because not everyone, I guess, is familiar with this relatively new technique. So the problem is that you want to use gradient descent to try and train a spiking neural network to do some task. You can't do that because a key part of the spiking neural network is that there's this threshold function, which basically says, did you fire a spike or not? And that threshold function is a Heaviside function, and it's non-differentiable. But it's only non-differentiable at one point, but its gradient is 0 everywhere except for that point where it's not differentiable. So using gradients with this function doesn't really work very well. So how can you use gradient descent? Well, one of the first ideas that people tried for this was Terry Sarnowski and I think he was a student, maybe a postdoc, who basically smoothed the Heaviside function. So this is what it should be, and then they just smoothed it to this. Okay, and then you can compute gradients and everything should work. And it sort of works, but it's very expensive. And also because you've changed the spiking to a sigmoid, it's not actually a spiking neural network anymore. So a more recent idea from Emre Nefsi and Friedemann Zenker and others is that you only smooth in the backward pass. So just to explain that a bit, in the forward pass, you basically take your inputs, you go through the network, you generate all the spiking. In the backward pass, you want to take a derivative essentially of the loss function with respect to the parameters of the network, and so that gradient information travels backwards through the network. And the idea that they had was keep the forward pass as it is, like that, it's still a spiking neural network. But in the backward pass, that's when you pretend that you had a smoothed version. So the gradients can flow backwards, but it's still a spiking neural network. And this is, in a way, a kind of crazy thing to do. It shouldn't work. You're following gradients from a function that's different from the one that you actually want to optimize. But it turns out that it does. And in fact, it's been a fantastically powerful tool for training spiking neural networks to do the sort of tasks that we've seen in machine learning, recognizing images, sounds, and stuff like that. To my knowledge, we don't have a good mathematical explanation as to why this works. If anyone has any ideas, I would be very interested to hear. It's not totally unheard of to use surrogate functions, but there's not really a really satisfying theoretical explanation of this to my knowledge. So this thing is still very computationally expensive. For those who care or know about machine learning stuff, you're doing backprop through time. So that means you have to unroll the loops. So I guess, and because it's a spiking neural network, you're dividing time into very small time intervals. So you end up unrolling a lot of loops. It gets very expensive very quickly. That's still a work in progress. There's some ideas about how to improve that, but it's, yeah, it's still a way off. Okay, all right, so interlude over. That's what surrogate gradient descent is. Let's have a quick look at the results. Okay, it works. Again, this is probably not surprising given that I'm talking about it. When we train on that task with this network where everything has a spiking neural network, it gets about 90% correct. So I always think it's very important when doing anything with machine learning to run a control. And that's because it's really easy to accidentally let through information that lets the machine learning algorithm solve the task without actually having to do anything to do with the task. There's this famous example of the artificial neural network that they trained to detect cancer. And it turned out that all of and it was using scans or something like that. And it turned out all of the scans that had cancer had a different logo on them than the ones that didn't have cancer. And all of this algorithm was doing was just detecting whether or not that logo was there. So you have to be careful that you're not accidentally providing information like that lets it shortcut and find a solution. So the control I decided to do was just delete the multisensory area entirely and just connect these directly to these decision units, thinking if there's no multisensory area, I can't do a multisensory task. But it could. And actually, it got almost as good performance without the multisensory area. So we banged our head against the wall for a long time about this, trying to find where we might accidentally have biased our data generation routines and blah, blah, blah. And we couldn't find a solution at first. But at least we thought, well, I mean, it is doing worse than without a multisensory area. But then, hang on, actually, this has fewer neurons than this. So let's maybe add one extra layer to this unisensory and see if it can, if that at least stays low. But unfortunately not. If you add in an extra layer here, then now the performance goes back to what it was without multisensory. So basically, multisensory area isn't helping you at all in this task. Okay, so we did eventually find the explanation. And I think I can explain this probably best with by talking about the sort of classical sort of Bayesian approach to solving these sorts of tasks. So let's abstract it a little bit. Here we've got the visual signal over time. And any given time, you might be receiving no information, like here or over here. You might be receiving some indication, evidence pointing that the object is moving to the right, or because it's noisy, you might receive some evidence suggesting that it's pointing to the left. And similarly for the auditory. But you can see here in this example, the correct direction is it's pointing to the right. So you can see here that there's more evidence pointing to the right than to the left, and maybe that's a good way of doing it. So we count up the number of rights and lefts. There's 5 rights in the visual, 3 lefts in the visual, 6 and 4 for the auditory, and then we sum over the different modalities, and we get right. There's 11 points suggesting right and 7 suggesting left, so it's probably right. And it turns out this is actually the optimal thing to do. So under sort of Bayesian maximum likelihood estimation sort of framework, we want to maximize the probability of a given direction. We want to choose the direction that maximizes the probability that the data is truly this direction, given that the observations that we've made. These are the observations we've made. And using Bayes' formula, you can switch that round, and that's the same as summing over all of the individual observations of the probability of that observation given a particular direction. But this only has 3 different values, depending on whether the observation is left, neutral, i.e. no observation, or right. And you're just summing over everything because everything is independent. So this is a weighted sum, which means that this formula is actually a linear formula. And that explains why this thing without a multisensory area works, because in every case, we always had this readout layer, which we kind of initially thought of as doing nothing, because we just had to have, there has to be a decision, and just having it, basically just sum its inputs was the sort of minimal thing it could possibly do. But that turns out that that's actually all you needed to do this task. All you needed is to sum all of the inputs linearly. So it shouldn't have been surprising in a way that this did work. All right. So to summarize the story so far, there's a multimodal task which you can solve linearly. You don't need a multisensory area to do it. But multisensory areas do exist in the brain, and they have lots of nonlinear units in them. So this is 2005 paper showing the additivity of units in, actually, I don't remember what animal this was in, but in some animal. And you can see, so linearity would be 0. You can see that most of the units are super additive. That is, if they have 2 inputs, the output is bigger than you would expect by summing the 2 inputs separately. And a few are subadditive. So what are they for if we don't need them to do this task? So a sort of null hypothesis would be, it's just hard to make a real neuron linear. Nonlinearity doesn't really hurt your performance very much. Maybe that's enough to explain it. And I think that's partly right. But there is also a more interesting hypothesis, which is that nonlinear computations are useful. And again, experience from machine learning, I think, tends to support this, because basically the difference between basically just multiplying a vector by a matrix and modern deep learning is the fact that you have a little nonlinear term in there, your ReLU term, and that's basically what lets everything else work. So there's actually a huge difference in having a bit of nonlinearity. A more specific version of that claim is that the task that we're using to probe multimodal processing is too simple in the real world. You would actually need that nonlinearity. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. That basically we looked at creating a harder and more, hopefully more realistic task. Okay, so the first step was to create a task that couldn't be solved linearly. And we call this the co-modulation task, as you'll see in a second. So as before, you have an auditory and a visual channel evolving over time. And at each time instant, you're either getting evidence suggesting that the direction is left, evidence suggesting it's right, or no evidence one way or the other. Now, the difference is in this one, we've balanced everything. So in each channel, you get exactly the same amount of information suggesting the target is moving left and that it's moving right. So there's the same number of lefts and rights. So that means that the previous technique couldn't work on this, this sort of standard classical model. The difference is that when both channels are indicating the same thing, that is giving a more likely to give you the correct information. So in this diagram, it's perfect, right? Every time you see both of them give the same information, it's giving the correct direction, it's giving left. So you can solve this by basically just looking for those points where both channels are giving the same information and then seeing what direction they're pointing in. And there's 2 versions of this. You can have a sort of exactly balanced version, as I've just described, or you can have a sort of probabilistically balanced version. And there's an important difference, but I'm not going to be talking about it more today. So I said that I would be looking at a more realistic task. Actually, I think this task is perhaps even more artificial than the classical task. But I will come back to that and make a more realistic version of this task. But hold that thought. Okay, so sure enough, it works. The unisensory models can't do the task. That's chance performance. And the multisensory version of the architecture can do the task, as hoped for. Humans can also do this task. So here, actually, I haven't talked about this, but we have a version where there's a sliding difficulty of how much coherence there is. At 0 coherence, you can't do better than chance. And 1 is basically what I've been describing so far. So by varying that and doing some sort of human sort of psychophysics on this, you can see that the model and the human are doing about the same. We haven't published this because so far we've just done it with the members of the lab. So it's like 3 or 4 people. So don't give the psychophysics too much credence yet. You can also get reaction times from this model and also from people. And again, they similarly have a similar sort of shape. Okay, so let's go back to the equations to try and explain a bit more what's going on here. So as I said, we want to do maximum likelihood estimation using Bayes' rule. We get this. Because each time instant in this task is independent of every other time instant, we can just sum over all of the time windows, the probability of the observation just at time t. Just rewriting that, that's the probability of a particular auditory and visual signal at time t. Now, those are independent. The two modalities are independent given the signal. So we can just expand this out as a product. And then because we're doing a log, we can change that product into a sum. And now we've got a sum over t of this sum. So we can just pull that out. And we get a sum over all of the auditory evidence plus a sum over all of the visual evidence. And that's the classical model of sort of evidence accumulation. So the way I've written it here is a sort of graph. We accumulate all of the visual information over time, we accumulate all of the auditory information over time, and then we linearly fuse those together to get a combined decision. Okay, but in the co-modulation task, you don't have this independence anymore. So you can't do these steps. And the best you can do is stop here. And in terms of this sort of picture, what does that look like? It means that instead of summing the evidence over time and then fusing, you have to fuse the evidence before doing the sum. So we call this one fuse, then accumulate. So this one we call accumulate, then fuse, and this one fuse, then accumulate. Okay. All right, and we're basically suggesting that this might be a better and more interesting model somehow of what multimodal processing is doing. Okay, so let's try and deal with the fact that the task is not really very realistic now. So here's our slightly better version of this task, which I'm calling the prey detection task. I said, David, that there's no animations. I realized that I do actually have a tiny little animation here. There's a little mouse moving back and forward. I don't know if everyone sees that. So, okay, so we've got this little mouse moving back and forward. Sometimes it's behind a tree, in which case we're not going to get any visual information, probably not going to get any auditory information either. But there's moments where it pops out from between the trees, and then we'll get some auditory and visual information. So that's a slightly more realistic task. And I'm going to represent it mathematically like this. We have a few different variables. We have m, whether or not the mouse is absent, which is m equals 0, or present and moving left -1 or right +1. So that's fixed for a whole trial. And there's a few variables that vary for the different time windows. So E says whether or not the mouse is emitting a signal at time t or not. So if it's not emitting a signal, i.e. it's behind the tree, E equals 0. And when it is emitting a signal between the trees, E equals 1. Again, at any instant, we have what visual information we're receiving. So we might be getting no visual information pointing left or right, in which case V is 0, or it might be indicating -1 left or +1 right. And similarly for the auditory. And we have sort of basically a probability distribution for each of these, which gives us a graphical model of this setup. Another property I want to include here is sparsity. What I mean by that is it's rare that both the mouse is present and it's emitting a signal. So I think, again, a reasonable model of a predator-prey scenario, the predator typically has to wait a long time for a prey to come along, and the prey is going to try and hide its movements because it doesn't want the predator to get a ton of information that would let it eat it. And that there's a low but not negligible level of background noise. So what that means is that because the level of background noise is low, coincidences are rare. In other words, if both the auditory and video signals are telling you left, that's rare to happen in background noise. But it's never going to happen. It's just rare. But when the signal is being emitted, coincidences become much more common. So it's a relatively high signal to noise ratio signal. And that means that coincidences are a reliable indicator of the presence and the direction of the mouse. So you have a strategy, again, which is to just basically look at only the coincident moments in time and only use that evidence. And you can now compare to the linear strategy, which can't make use of that coincidence information. And that linear strategy performs poorly. And we'll see the results next. Okay, so all right, first result is that the spiking neural networks can do this task. Here in gray is the ideal performance if you do the sort of maximum likelihood estimation model. And this sort of greenish bluish color here is the spiking neural network. And you can see it almost does as well as ideal, even though there's some noise here. That's the difference, I think. And the multimodal architecture does have an advantage over the unimodal architectures. So that's the two purple curves here. And this Yeah, so you don't just get a chance level for the unimodal in this case, because you can just do the linear strategy here. You do have enough information to solve the task. If you have enough evidence comes in, eventually you will have enough despite the background noise. But you get the evidence comes in much more quickly, essentially, if you do this coincidence strategy. And another interesting feature here is that the performance difference depends on how much sparsity there is. So what I've been talking about so far is this sparse case, where the times where the signal is on are rare. And here you see a big difference between the two strategies. Here, the blue curve is the classical linear accumulate and fuse model, and the pink is our updated coincidence detection, fuse, then accumulate model. However, if the signal becomes much more dense, the difference between these two strategies gets much smaller. And in the limit, it actually just becomes the same as the classical task. So this is, strictly speaking, an extension of this sort of classical multimodal processing task. Okay. So the next question is how well does this thing generalize? Because this, again, very specific setup here. We check this in a few ways. I'll just talk about one today, which is we generalize the number of classes and the number of modalities. So in the classical task that I talked about at the beginning, there were two classes that could be left or it could be right. In the prey detection, there was also a possibility that there was no target. So that was 3 classes. In general, we can upgrade that to K classes and going from 2 modalities up to L modalities. And it turns out the solution is basically the same. I say basically because, okay, so this is the Bayesian calculation, the probability calculation again, the maximum likelihood estimator. We get basically this bit is the same, but there's now this addition of this function soft plus here. So soft plus is this function. It looks like this. So it's nonlinear. And basically that's all we had to do. All we have to do to get this generalization to K classes, L modalities, with the same sort of graphical model setup is to add this soft plus function in, which is quite nice. We just have to add one little nonlinearity, soft plus, and we get a whole bunch of nice extra performance in a much wider class of problems. And it turns out you don't even particularly need to model this nonlinearity in much detail. If you just replace this with a piecewise linear approximation, so that's ReLU, rectified linear unit, you actually can't numerically see the difference in performance between using the correct function and this ReLU function. And actually, it doesn't even matter that you use ReLU. Pretty much any nonlinearity is fine, including the spiking nonlinearity. All right, so basically just by throwing in a bit of nonlinearity, you can solve a much wider range of tasks. All right, the next thing we wanted to do is sort of compare this to experimental data. So I talked before about this additivity plot here. Additivity, by the way, I didn't give the full definition before. Basically, it's that when you have both inputs being fed into the neuron, and you divide that by the sum of just one input and just the other input, that ratio is the additivity. So if this is 1, it's linear. If it's greater than 1, it's super additive. If it's less than 1, it's subadditive. And so that's what's being plotted here. So our first idea of this was to look at the sort of null hypothesis explanation that we came up with, which is maybe it's just a not very informative thing about the fact that it's kind of hard to get linear spiking units. And indeed, if we just initialize the parameters of these neurons sort of randomly, different time constant, different weights, different input firing rates, we can see a whole range of different additivities. So here, the red means super additive, white is linear, and blue is subadditive. So you can see that in this sort of parameter space, there's a whole bunch of different values going from super additive to subadditive. So if you're not controlling for trying to get linearity here, you probably won't get it. So you probably would see something like this purely by chance. By the way, this over here is a diffusion approximation of a simulation over here. It does a pretty good job in this case. So, all right. So again, I don't think that on the basis of this, we don't really have enough evidence to say that this experimental data tells us anything about multimodal processing. It might just tell us that we're using neurons to do this calculation. But we do have a little bit of evidence that there is something going on. And essentially, this is that if we train different versions of the task, so this is the dense version of the task, and this is the sparse version of the task, and we order the neurons by their additivity, and we delete the first k of those units, or the last k of those units, we can see how much it depends on having low or high additivity in the network. And basically what we find from this, so this picture is kind of hard to read, but I'll just give you the conclusion from it, which is that if you're in the dense task, essentially having low additivity units is important. And if you're in the sparse task, having high additivity units is important. And essentially this just more or less corresponds to the time constant. Because for the dense task, you essentially want integrators. You want to sum as much as possible over time. And integrators tend to have lower additivity than coincidence detectors. Whereas for the sparse task, you need to do this coincidence detection. So you want some neurons with a very small time constant, and those tend to have higher additivity. So it tells you something, this additivity, but it may just be a proxy for time constant. Okay, that's more or less what I wanted to say. There are going to be some next steps for this work. We're looking into more complex tasks. So one possible thing you could do is look at a sort of continuous time version, because at the moment I've divided time into discrete windows. Having that be sort of continuous time where things can come on or off instantaneously. That might be good for spiking neural networks because they have nice properties for responding to sort of instantaneous signals. We're not working on that part right now. We can drop the independence of the time steps. That's a sort of slightly unrealistic part of the task, right? Like if at time t equals 5, you get one piece of information. At time t equals 6, you don't necessarily have anything. So all time is totally independent of each other. So I have a visiting student, Swathi Anil, who's working on a version of this task where we have a switching behavior. So the signal, it stays on and then switches off, or stays off and then switches on with some probability each time step. That's slightly more realistic, but it seems, as far as I can tell, that this is mathematically intractable to solve this in a sort of optimal maximum likelihood estimator way. Or no, you can write down the solution, but it's not something that you could imagine neurons doing easily. Okay, and the other thing that we're looking at is using more complex environments with mazes and things like that, and that's Marcus Grosch's project, who's the co-author, the big co-author of this. We're also hoping to do some experimental work. We're applying for funding, so far unsuccessfully, with Jenny Bisley at UCL. We'd like to do behavior and electrophysiology in ferrets. That's what her lab does. And we'd also like to do the human psychophysics properly. But yeah, like I say, haven't got the funding yet. Hopefully that will come in. All right, take-home messages. I guess nonlinear interactions are probably, I think, important in a realistic multimodal setting. The spiking nonlinearity is good enough for this. And I think probably for me, the big take-home question is, I think we should be looking at more realistic multimodal tasks that have some interesting temporal components and temporal structure that we need to make use of. And a sort of side benefit of all of this is that we can use the surrogate gradient descent to train spiking neural networks to do interesting, more realistic tasks with temporal sort of component. And that gives us a model that we can then compare to psychophysics and electrophysiology, because it's directly in the right form to do that comparison. So I think doing all of this is worthwhile. Yeah, that's it for the moment. Thank you to the co-authors, Gabriel Bernauer, Marcus Grosch, and Volker, who was Marcus's supervisor in Paris when he was doing this work. That's it. Thank you very much.